Hello and welcome to Trails Worth Hiking, the show that brings you some of the most interesting backpacking and trekking routes in the world. I'm your host, Jeremy Pendry. In the first part of the show, we bring you the story and history of a trail. Then we tell you what it's like to hike the trail and how you can do it. On this episode, we go back to the Blue Ridge Mountains in the eastern United States for a several-day hike through a national forest that was once Cherokee land, where we'll cross beautiful but steep and rocky terrain, traversing ridges and peaks on this challenging yet rewarding route. On this episode of Trails Worth Hiking, we travel the Art Loeb Trail in the Pisgah National Forest in western North Carolina. Welcome to the show, everyone. Let's start this episode with our Walking the Walk segment, where we highlight listeners who have hiked a trail after either hearing about it on the show or at least being inspired to go hike the trail, even if they knew about it before they heard the episode. We'll start with Sonia Benke. Sonia and her husband in October hiked several routes of the Kumano-Kodo in Japan, which we covered on episode 25. Sonia and her husband hiked for 9 days, which included a couple of 0 days for sightseeing. They hiked several routes, a few of which we didn't talk about on the episode. They hiked the Choishimichi Trail, the Kohechi Trail, and the second half of the Nakahechi Trail. All of these trails are part of the Kumano-Kodo, but I believe we only talked about the Nakahechi Trail on the episode. They hiked a total of over 70 miles with more than 20,000 feet of elevation gain. They stayed at a Buddhist temple. They really enjoyed seeing the various shrines along the trail, including the Kumano Hongu Taisha and the Kumano Nachi Taisha at the end of the trail. They chose the route they did because they wanted to do more miles and do something a bit more challenging than just the traditional Nakahechi route. The Kohechi is more mountainous with steeper terrain than the Nakahechi. Even though the mileage was pretty short per day, it was a pretty strenuous hike, gaining about 1,000 feet per mile. And there weren't many other hikers on the Kohechi route. Overall, they had a fantastic trip, and it was something Sonia had been dreaming about for years, so she thought it was fabulous to finally accomplish the hike. So congratulations to Sonia and her husband on their hike of the Kumano-Kodo, which, as I said, you can learn more about in episode 25. I also wanted to highlight Ian from England, who reached out. He was excited to hear in our episode about the Yorkshire Wolds Way that there was actually a trail that went through that area that was a national trail and continuous in the way that we described, because he says he's hiked there many times, but he didn't know that trail was there. So it's great that even someone from England can learn something from the show. Ian wrote in, though, also to tell us about his hike on the Rota Vicentina in Portugal, which we covered back in episode 10. He wanted to highlight that there's different ways to hike a trail, and his experience was a bit different than our guest on that episode, Sabrina. He hiked the trail in November 2022 and again in November 2023, but started several days further north in 2023. But rather than having baggage transfers and staying in hotels and guest houses, he spent 8 days walking solo, carrying too much stuff, and camping or staying in hostels. So he had a little bit more budget experience, but sounded like he had a fantastic experience nonetheless. And again, I've mentioned this before, but it's just neat to hear all the different ways people can accomplish a hike and how they can see the same hike differently. And so I'm glad Ian went and did a hike his way. And when you plan your own hikes, think about the best way for you to do them, not necessarily trying to reproduce the way you heard it on the show. So congratulations to both Sonia and Ian on their hikes. And if you've hiked a trail that you learned about on the show or were inspired to hike by the show, reach out to me at trailsworthhiking@gmail.com and let me know. And I can feature you on a future episode in this Walking the Walk segment. All right, let's talk about the trail for this episode. Our guest on the show today is listener Dane Schuckman, who lives in North Carolina, where the Art Loeb Trail is. The majority of the United States population lives in the eastern United States, but the West does have a huge amount of long-distance hiking opportunities, and because I live in the West, it's sort of my natural tendency to focus on a lot of hikes in the West, also because I happen to think they're fantastically beautiful. And I don't have a lot of experience hiking in the East, but I wish I did have more experience there because I know so many of you live within driving distance of some of the great hikes in the eastern United States. So I do want to cover as many of those great hikes as I can, and this episode is an effort to do that because my goal is to get you out hiking and trekking and backpacking wherever you live, and it's certainly easier to do closer to home. So the Art Loeb Trail is just one of many great backpacking opportunities in the eastern U.S., and I'm glad we can focus on that trail in this episode. The Art Loeb Trail is in western North Carolina, which is in the Appalachian Mountains. It has the highest peaks in the eastern United States in this area. There are 125 peaks of over 5,000 feet in altitude. Mount Mitchell is there, which is the highest peak in the eastern United States at 6,684 feet, which is a little over 2,000 meters. Asheville, North Carolina is kind of the urban center for the area. And the Great Smoky Mountains and the Blue Ridge Mountains are both in western North Carolina. One mountain that's interesting that Dane and I talk about during the episode that's right along the trail, or a very short detour from the trail, I should say, is Cold Mountain, which is over 6,000 feet, about 1,840 meters, and it's one of the Great Balsam Mountains of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Most of the mountain is in the Shining Rock Wilderness of the Pisgah National Forest. The reason I mention Cold Mountain here is because it was made famous by the 1997 novel by Charles Frazier that won the National Book Award for fiction here in the United States. The novel is a story of a wounded deserter from the Confederate Army returning at the end of the Civil War to find the love of his life that he had been thinking about during the war. There was a 2003 film made from the book that starred Jude Law, Nicole Kidman, and Renee Zellweger. Renee Zellweger actually won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress for her role in the movie. The movie was praised for its accurate portrayal of the time and the place. But what's interesting is the movie was actually filmed in Romania, not in western North Carolina, where the actual Cold Mountain is. And that's because it was a lot cheaper and because there was less modern infrastructure in the mountains in Romania. So it was easier to keep things like power lines out of the shots. So nonetheless, still a great portrayal of the area, even though not actually filmed there, strangely. The Pisgah National Forest has been there since 1916. It was one of the first national forests in the eastern United States. The word Pisgah is a biblical Hebrew word that can mean a high achievement or an actual mountain summit. With all of the high mountains in the area, it seems to fit the surroundings. Some of the land that's part of the Pisgah National Forest was part of the Vanderbilt's Biltmore estate before it was sold to the federal government in 1914. George Vanderbilt had died, and his widow Edith Vanderbilt sold the land to the government for $5 an acre. It's a land of pine and oak, hardwood and spruce, so quite a big mix of trees. There are black bears, bobcats, deer, coyote, and beaver, to name a few of the animals, or at least a few of the mammals, I should say. Human history in the area goes back thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands. But in more recent history, before Europeans, this was the historic home of the Cherokee Native Americans. And today, there is still the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians that is there. Although they are a small portion of what is left of the Cherokee, many of you may have heard of the Trail of Tears. In the 1830s, many of the Cherokee were forcibly removed from their home in the region. Europeans came to the area in the late 18th century and settled on farms. And that was after the French and Indian War made the area a little bit safer to settle after that was over. And then in the 19th century, there was mining and logging that was happening pretty extensively in the area. The recreational history goes back quite a ways as well. The Carolina Mountain Club was formed in 1923, originally as a spinoff from the Appalachian Mountain Club. and their focus is on conservation, hikes, and building and maintaining trails. And they were originally responsible for a big section of the Appalachian Trail, but have also been responsible for the Art Loeb Trail since it was created. So we've mentioned the name Art Loeb several times, but who was Art Loeb? Art Loeb grew up in Philadelphia, the son of German Jewish immigrants. He went to Yale University, and his family had a tobacco importing business, and he went into the family business. Part of that tobacco business, though, was making the fine paper that was used for cigarette wrappings, and interestingly, also to make Bibles. He and his wife moved to Brevard in North Carolina, in this region, in 1936, where he began to work for his cousin's paper mill, and they raised their family there. He spent some time away from the area during World War II when he was in the service, but then came back to Brevard afterward. And he eventually became vice president and general manager of the paper division of the family's chemical company there. And we probably would have never heard of him again, at least in this context, except for a serious health problem. In his 40s, he had a heart attack, and his doctor prescribed exercise. This got him out hiking. And once he started going hiking, that got him out into the wild Pisgah National Forest. At the time, this meant bushwhacking, orienteering, and relying on old maps. There really weren't good established trails then. And he was part of the Carolina Mountain Club, and he and his friends created a lot of the trails that are still there today. Unfortunately, Art Loeb died in 1968 from a brain tumor at the age of 54. But he left a legacy of conservation, trail maintenance, and community involvement. I understand the irony of someone being a conservationist who was also part of a company that was taking advantage of the natural resources of the area to make paper. It's one of those things we see in history where there are a lot of contradictions like that. I don't have any information as to what extent this company was responsible in the way that it handled its business, but I just note that it's interesting that there's a strong conservation legacy from an executive of a company that was extracting natural resources from the region for whatever that's worth. Life is full of contradictions. Only a year after his death, the Art Loeb Trail was dedicated. The Arthur J. Loeb Memorial Trail came into existence in 1969. It was meant to be a high ridgeline path through the areas that Art Loeb had loved. So with that background and introduction, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dane Schuckman about his hike on the Art Loeb Trail. Dane Schuckman, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Good evening, Jeremy. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to talk today about the Art Loeb Trail, but I'm curious to know how you got into backpacking and sort of what your background is in doing these kinds of trips.
Well, I did some car camping in college, but not much hiking and no long-distance backpacking. And then when I met my wife in early 2018, one thing we very quickly bonded over was our love of the outdoors. And now we have our 3-year-old daughter, and I have a 12-year-old son, and we're an outdoors family. They love to go hiking and camping, and it's given us a chance to introduce them to that. And I also volunteer for local trails organizations and conservation organizations. I lead hikes. So that's how I fell into it.
And how did you learn about the Art Loeb Trail as an opportunity to do a multi-day hike?
I'm sure it had come up hearing about it from friends who had hiked it or reading about trails in the region that I'd want to do. And I know that it probably came up in the course of looking at options for family trips because we spend as much time as we can in the mountains. So we usually have at least a week out in the western part of the state every year, and I'm sure I'd noticed it and had put it on a list of trails that I wanted to try for myself, not necessarily with the kids.
And so what attracted you to doing this trail when you got word of it or saw it when you were out there for other reasons?
It was the next step up, the next level of a challenge. It had less miles than a short through hike I had done the previous year. but more challenging terrain, beautiful landscape, and it was close enough to get there or return in one day. And it was an opportunity to hike with a good friend of mine who was equally enthusiastic about the trail. I couldn't pass that up.
So what did you then do to go about planning the hike?
I found some really helpful online resources. There is a particular YouTube video from Unfettered Footsteps called Hiking the Art Loeb Trail, Logistics and Planning. That was a good starting point. This is somebody who had hiked the trail recently and had some very helpful logistical information. There's a great blog post on the trek by an author named Jesse Robinson who had done the trail in one weekend. And then there is also the Art Loeb Facebook group. And that's a wealth of information also in very real time. Yeah, that was the most recent, the most current resource for trail conditions and some really, really useful firsthand knowledge from people who had hiked as recently as the days before we started. I also used the Pisgah Mapco Pisgah Ranger District app, the Anti-Gravity Gear ALT Trail Guide, and All Trails. All Trails was my go-to for actually drawing the route out, calculating distance per day. So all of that research came together.
So one thing I noticed, Dane, is that you put together quite a detailed spreadsheet in planning this hike, and I was quite impressed with that. It's more than I would ever do in preparing for a hike, although I try to prepare fairly well. Can you talk a little bit about what you were doing there and how you were and what you were trying to accomplish? Because I think it is a tool that some people like to use and some people are more effective than others at it. And yours was certainly comprehensive.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I enjoyed building it and figuring out how I could use it as a tool for the most effective planning possible. I'm a planner. I'm a gadget geek. My wife and kids have decided that my trail name is Checklist, so that doesn't at all.
Perfect.
Yeah. But I built that spreadsheet when I was preparing for the Uwharrie through hike in 2022, but the hike was organized by a land trust, so I didn't need as much detail. And then when I was planning the Art Loeb hike, it evolved significantly. I added or changed formulas for calculating weight and distance, anticipating weather conditions, calculating calories for food, and all the preparation really paid off. I was glad I put that much effort into it.
That was my next question was it worth it? Because it's one thing to put all the information together. It's another thing to go out and do a hike, right?
Yes. It helped with the packing process and making sure that I was as efficient as possible. I'm not the type to shave down the handle of my toothbrush, but I do, not that there's anything wrong with that. I don't go quite to that length to conserve weight, but I do want to be conscious of what I'm carrying. And so that was a huge help. It helped with the meal planning. It helped with planning for the weather. It was absolutely worth it. Yes.
So speaking of the weather, when did you do this hike and what season would you recommend people do this hike in?
We did this hike the weekend immediately after July 4th. We had originally planned to do it the first weekend in June because in my advanced planning, I had called the ranger station and got some information, just general information on the trail. And I asked about the optimal window of time to do the hike in between, say, last snowfall and getting too hot in the summer. And the ranger said that up through mid to late May, there are times where it could get a little icy. So you want to shoot for maybe early June, and that would be ideal. And that seemed to work out for our schedule. So that's what we went with. It got pushed back about a month due to some personal obligations that we each had.
Was it pretty hot?
It was. It wasn't nearly as warm as it was here back home that weekend, but with all the exertion, I definitely would have enjoyed, 10, 15 degrees cooler daytime temperatures. Definitely. So
this is pretty much a summer and early fall kind of hike.
Yes. It would have been much more comfortable to hike right at the beginning or end of the window when we could avoid snowfall and ice.
Obviously, you have to avoid the snow and ice, but it's also helpful to avoid the really strong heat of the summer as well, right? It's nice to be maybe closer to fall or closer to early summer.
Absolutely, because there are a lot of exposed ridge lines.
Okay.
And it's really beating down on you.
And not a lot of water, right? That was surprising for me to hear, especially in North Carolina. I would think there's going to be a lot of water, but I guess because you're on ridges, there are pretty significant stretches without water. How did you deal with that?
Exactly. Water definitely was a concern. We'd read about that in the advanced planning, and I had kind of collected in the course of my research the waypoints on the trail where I knew that people had confirmed there to be water sources. So I had all this mapped out, but it was still spread out. The advice that we had was to just camel up, fill up to full capacity at any water source you find if you're able, because it's going to be a little while before the next one, especially with the warmer weather and the exertion. Some of those steep climbs, it definitely paid off to fill up like that. Yeah.
Another gear issue I saw is that bear cans are now required in this area, which was surprising for me to hear because I always thought of that as a, Western Sierra thing that we deal with out here, but I didn't realize that there were parts of the eastern United States where bear cans were required.
Absolutely. In fact, I think it's Shenandoah National Park. You're required through the whole distance of the park to have one. Smoky Mountains National Park, you're required to have one the whole length of the Appalachian Trail through there. And there are sections of the Mountain to Sea Trail and other local trails in the western part of the state that are closed down regularly because of bear activity. But I think part of that is humans being irresponsible in the bear's environment.
Sure.
But you do have to carry a bear canister north of the Blue Ridge Parkway. And most of that is the Shining Rock Wilderness. And I'm very glad we carried the canisters because we had a bear visit our campsite the first night. And we didn't see it, but I definitely heard it. And the next morning, we saw this big flattened area of grass at the edge of the campsite near the bear canisters where I'm guessing it had laid down to take a nap.
So speaking of campsites, I noticed from some of the notes you had that you actually went with a hammock on this trip. And was that something new for you? And if so, what did you think of that experience?
It was. I had actually decided about 24 hours out to settle on the hammock instead of the tent. I had tested it the week before and thought it was so comfortable and I would save a significant amount of weight. And the weather was warm enough that I didn't need to carry the top quilt and the underquilt. I just carried a lightweight 50-degree sleeping bag to put over me. And I'm so glad I did that. I was so comfortable. I slept so well. And I think I'm a hammock convert. There are still times where I'll use the tent. For example, if I go back and, say, camp at Black Balsam Knob for a night, I would want to camp up at the top where you've got that beautiful night sky and the sunrise. So there are definitely times where I'll still go back to the tent, but using the hammock was a really cool experience and it worked really well.
That's cool to hear. There are definitely folks that I've hiked with that use hammocks out here in the West, but we have a lot of areas that are above tree line as well, where it's a lot more difficult prospect to find a place to put up a hammock.
We ran into that at Black Balsam Knob. We had to go down towards the trailhead in the parking lot to find a grove of trees. We were hoping to find something a little closer up so we could enjoy that view, but it didn't work out quite like we planned, but it was still fine. We were still having a good time.
So you mentioned, I think already, the map that you used and some of the apps that you looked into. But I was just wondering, once you're out there on this trail, how is the signage? Is it pretty easy to follow? Or is it something where you really do need to pay attention to navigation?
In the Shining Rock Wilderness, there are no trailblazes and there's almost no signage. I remember the kiosk at the trailhead. There is one sign at Deep Gap on Cold Mountain, where the spur trail going up to the summit of Cold Mountain meets the trail, and there's a little campsite there. The only other sign we saw was where you have a trail junction with the Little East Fork Trail and the spur trail off to Shining Rock and the campsite at Shining Rock. Other than that, we didn't see anything until we hit the border for the Shining Rock Wilderness, and then we started to see those brown metal signposts for the U.S. Forestry Service.
How much of the trail is within the Shining Rock Wilderness, sort of percentage-wise? Just roughly.
Yeah, the northernmost 8.7 miles, I think it is.
Okay. So that's the part where there's not great signage or none at all, pretty much. But after that, there pretty much is.
Correct. And through most of the trail, there are a few areas that kind of get overgrown in the summer, but it's well maintained and easy to follow. This is a popular trail, so it gets enough traffic that the trail is pretty clear, and the Carolina Mountain Club will go out and do trail work days to kind of keep it safe and clear.
Where do you start this trail, and how do you get there? Is from where you live? How much of a drive is this? And, you know, if someone was coming from further afield, where would they go to get to this trail?
From Chapel Hill, it was about a 4-hour and 20-minute drive to Brevard. We took Interstate 40 most of the way. And you could start from the northern terminus or the southern terminus. The northern end of the trail is at the Daniel Boone Boy Scout Camp, and the southern end is in Brevard at the Davidson River Campground. And you could start from either direction you wanted to.
Did you drop off your car at the southern end and then take a shuttle back to the northern end?
We did. We left Troy's car at the southern terminus. He offered to drive because I'd done all the driving for the training hikes. And we met the shuttle, and the shuttle took us to the northern terminus and dropped us off at the scout camp, and we started from there.
Why did you decide to go southbound?
Elevation gain. Going southbound, you've got about 2,000 feet less of elevation gain than going north. I wouldn't do it the other way. Having seen how difficult it could be going up some of those slopes that we went down, I am very happy with our choice to go southbound, and I really don't have an interest to try the northbound route.
Do you need a permit to do this hike?
No permits. You don't even need a parking pass at the trailheads. There is a decent amount of parking at the southern trailhead, and parking is more limited at the scout camp at the northern trailhead. But there's no need for any kind of registration or trail permit, nothing like that.
So for someone who's never been to this area, I mean, I think of the East in my mind, not having spent a lot of time there, as being sort of the tree tunnel, the proverbial tree tunnel with, you know, a lot of vegetation, a lot of hardwood. Am I picturing the right thing, or what does this area look like?
There's quite a bit of that. Although with the exposed ridge lines and some of the balds, you do get a really spectacular view of the Pisgah National Forest at times. The attraction that most people have for going northbound is they're saving all the big views for the second half, for the end. They want that big finish. And I can see that. But I'm going to enjoy those views southbound also. We really did. But in addition to the sweeping views, you do have a little bit of that tunnel effect. We hiked through tunnels of rhododendron that were just beautiful and kind of closed in around us like something from Lord of the Rings. It was gorgeous. And the vegetation is thick. You've got these beautiful birch and oak and pine trees and wildflowers everywhere, and more species of mushroom and moss and lichen than you could ever hope to count. And you do sometimes feel a little bit surrounded and closed in by the forest, but it's beautiful, and that's what we're out there for.
It's also difficult, though, right? I mean, it sounded like from your description to me and some of your notes on this hike that this was a pretty difficult hike. So what made it so difficult?
Yeah. The elevation was part of it. Even though you have 2,000 feet less of elevation going southbound, it's still a challenge. And there are places where the terrain itself is difficult. Specifically, the Narrows, which is just past Cold Mountain, kind of between Cold Mountain and Stairs Mountain. It's a very narrow ridge line where there's some rock scrambling, and the rhododendron on either side of the trail closes in to the point where the space that was clear for us to see ahead was right about where the shoulder straps were on my pack. It's right on either side of my face. It was pretty close, and there's a reason why it's called the Narrows. And then there was another area descending down to the Blue Ridge Parkway. After Black Balsam Knob and Silvermine Bald, you drop down pretty steeply towards the parkway, and then from there you continue through the second half of the trail. And that drop down right towards the parkway, right as you're coming down towards the road, it's extremely steep. And the Carolina Mountain Club has done a fantastic job of building stairs to make it safer, but I can't imagine climbing up those stairs going the other direction. And I absolutely would not try it when there was ice, because I think that could be pretty hazardous.
How crowded was the trail?
Not too crowded. Not as crowded as I expected it to be the weekend after July 4th. We did pass hikers of the day section and through variety all along the trail from start to finish. We passed some through hikers that were doing 3 or 4 days like we were. And then there were 2 guys who caught up with us that did the trail overnight.
Wow.
Which seems pretty amazing to me. Apparently they started Saturday morning at Daniel Boone Scout Camp, caught up with us Saturday night at about 10 p.m. at Butter Gap Shelter, and then passed us the next morning, and we caught up to them at the southern terminus.
Yeah, there's always guys out there who are doing, like every time I do a trail, there's somebody doing it faster than I'm doing it. And even when I used to do trails fairly quickly, which I don't anymore, there was still guys who were doing them faster. I remember I did a trail, several days faster than I thought was reasonable. And then somebody else was doing it in half that time, just always, at some point you wonder, are they really enjoying the trail? But maybe what they're enjoying is the challenge of it versus the sort of natural beauty and what they're out there to see. So maybe it's a different sort of enjoyment, but type 2 fun, as they say.
Yes. And there were quite a few sections of type 2 fun there. Yeah, I wasn't concerned with the rush. I wasn't concerned with speeding through it because I wanted to enjoy every step of it that I could, every moment.
So this trail is about 30 miles, right?
Yes. I ended up clocking, let's see here. There was an extra 3 miles for the round trip up to the summit of Cold Mountain.
Okay.
On Friday morning.
Can I stop you there? Let me stop you there for a second. Is Cold Mountain, that is the Cold Mountain of the book and movie fame?
It is, yes.
That's cool.
Yeah. And it is a gorgeous view from the top. It's not officially part of the trail, but we decided to add it on because it was right there. We couldn't pass it up. So we had 2 plans for starting out. We were either going to camp Thursday evening at a section of the Shining Rock Wilderness right outside the boundary of the scout camp, because you're not allowed to camp there in the scout camp unless you're with a Boy Scout group. So we would camp Thursday night, hit the trail Friday morning, summit Cold Mountain as a little side trip that morning as we got started. Or Thursday, we would climb up to the top of Cold Mountain, stay there Thursday night, and we're already up there Friday morning when we continue on. We ended up just starting Thursday afternoon instead of camping. We didn't want to wait. We decided to go ahead and start our climb up the mountain. We got to Deep Gap and we were exhausted. Made camp and did summit the next morning to have breakfast and enjoy the view before we continued on the trail. And if you can do that, I recommend it. It's a steep climb. It's 1.5 miles up and then 1.5 miles down with 1,000 feet of elevation gain. But it's totally worth it once you get up there.
That's great advice. That's good to hear. It's hard when you do a multi-day through hike to think about doing a side trip.
It is.
Because you're always sort of focused on moving forward. But if there's something worth doing, you never know if or when you'll come back. So you should do it. So that's great to hear.
Exactly. And there are so many of those on this trail. There's the spur trail to Shining Rock. You could break off and explore Graveyard Fields. You could spend a little extra time at Black Balsam Knob and go a little further past the trailhead there to explore Sam's Knob. There are so many opportunities to extend the hike if you have the interest and the time to do so.
You guys planned to do this hike in 4 days. How did that work out as far as pacing? Was that a good pace for you guys?
It worked out well. We started Thursday afternoon and finished early Sunday afternoon. And I think that gave us enough time to get all the miles in. I would, doing it again, add an extra day so that we could explore Shining Rock and Graveyard Fields, some of those other places I mentioned. But the itinerary that ended up playing out was great.
So you mentioned, I think, a little bit how it went the first day, but let's go through the itinerary to talk about your hike. So the first day, as you mentioned, you started at the Daniel Boone Boy Scout camp.
Yes.
And you ended up doing Cold Mountain the next morning, not that day, right? Was that what I heard?
Correct.
Okay, so where did you end up camping that night, and how did that go?
We started from Daniel Boone Scout Camp and climbed up to Deep Gap, which is a sharp turn on the trail about a mile down from the summit. And we were just exhausted. It was a tough climb. We were just not prepared to climb up to the top and thought, you know what, we'll just wake up early, we'll climb it in the morning, and then we'll come back down, break camp, and continue on. And that worked out pretty well.
And then what about the second day? You had Deep Gap to Black Balsam Knob.
Yes. That was the section of trail where most people expect those beautiful sweeping views, and you get them. We left the Deep Gap campsite, and I should clarify that the Deep Gap campsite is one of probably maybe half a dozen times you'll see Deep Gap on a map of Western North Carolina, because later on day, I guess technically day 3, it was Saturday, we did go through another Deep Gap, and there's a Deep Gap shelter that has been torn down and will be rebuilt. So when I say Deep Gap on the first day, it's the campsite on Cold Mountain.
Okay, and how was that spot? Is that an established? I guess the question I have is, on this trail, are the campsites primarily established clearings and areas where people regularly camp, or how does that work?
Sometimes. Most of the trail is dispersed camping.
Okay.
So that makes it very easy to adjust day to day if you find that your pace is a little off from what you expected. There's the established campsite at Deep Gap. There's camping at Shining Rock. There's a campsite at Ivester Gap.
Well, knowing what you now know about Cold Mountain, would it have been a good idea to camp at the summit?
Oh, absolutely. You can't camp right at the summit, but there are campsites along the trail as you get close to the top of the mountain.
All right, and day 2 was the day that you also, is that when you went through the Narrows?
Yes. So on day 2, we started with the climb up Cold Mountain, came back down, broke camp, and headed south through the Shining Rock Wilderness. The Narrows is immediately after Deep Gap and Cold Mountain. So you're following this narrow ridge line, you're scrambling over rocks, you're pushing your way through the rhododendron. You can tell that it's a steep drop on either side, but it's not hazardous. You're just very aware that you're on the ridge line. And then you look to your left or right every now and then, you see those sweeping views, and you kind of get a little bit of perspective for the height, the elevation, the way the forest just opens up below you. It's pretty beautiful. And then after the Narrows, you've got Stairs Mountain, and then the trail kind of opens up. It was a nice break after the very challenging section we just finished, because the Narrows is no joke. It's a it was a test. We had a lot of fun with it though. The after Stairs Mountain, the trail opens up, and we were hiking with a group of 6 for a little while, and one of them mentioned that it was an old railroad bed, and I can see that. I'm not for certain, but I could definitely see how the trail was actually constructed. That's why that section was chosen. And it was a break for us. It was easier on the feet and easier on the legs, so that was nice.
It always feels good when you can get some miles on flat ground because
Oh yeah,
you feel like the miles are so hard when you're going up and down, up and down, up and down, and it almost feels like cheating when you get a couple miles of flat, straight ground.
absolutely. So this was a nice little break. And then we branched off where that one signpost was that I mentioned, and you can go towards Shining Rock or you can continue south. And we continued south. We hit one of those tunnels of rhododendron. We climbed or went around a few peaks and went through Flower Gap, which was gorgeous. There were 2 campers there that had set up right in the middle of the gap, and they had the sunrise and the sunset. They said, this is where we decided to stop because of the view.
Well, you guys ended up at Black Balsam Knob. What was that area like?
Yes, Black Balsam Knob is the next major point on the trail past that. You do summit Tennant Mountain right before that, which is another gorgeous view, and you can look out towards Mount Pisgah. And then past that, you come up to the top of Black Balsam Knob, and it's very popular because the sunrise and the sunset are just gorgeous from up there when the skies are clear. And I can imagine the night sky is absolutely beautiful.
All right. And then day 3, Black Balsam Knob to Butter Gap. What was that like?
That was more of the green tunnel that we talked about earlier. The views were not as frequent. You had that steep drop down towards the Blue Ridge Parkway. And then we passed the site where the Deep Gap shelter would be, or will be when it's reconstructed. Sassafras Mountain was a standout. There's a beautiful rhododendron tree that comes out of the rocks. It's this one single tree of rhododendron. I've never seen anything like it before, standing alone. But it kind of twisted out of this pile of rocks, and there were these big, beautiful white flowers. And as we climbed up Pilot Mountain, we saw the slope crisscrossed by these cast iron pipes that we were pretty sure were a water supply for a moonshine still, but we never saw the side of the still. Now, I should also clarify that Pilot Mountain is not the same Pilot Mountain State Park in the central part of the state. There are 2.
Okay.
We love our deep gaps and our Pilot Mountains here.
Apparently.
Can't get enough.
Okay. And then your last day is Butter Gap to Davidson River. And that sounds like that was maybe a partial day.
It was. We started early in the morning from Butter Gap and made it to the southern trailhead right after lunch. And that was a pretty stretch of trail, especially right after Butter Gap, because you're in this beautiful area at the base of Cedar Rock, where you can kind of see this huge monolith of stone with no tree or shrubs on it, just rising up out of the ground through the trees. And then you go through Sandy Gap, and the soil there is sandy, unlike anything you'd seen before on the trail. It was really unique. And then the rest of the trail to the southern terminus was more of the green tunnel. At that point, we were motivated by a giant cup of iced tea or lemonade at the end. We were starting to feel the heat, and we were a little sore, so it was nice to know that we're reaching the end.
Well, this sounds like it was a pretty challenging trip overall. As you look back on it, are there things you would have done differently, or do you feel like you had it pretty dialed in?
As far as gear and preparation, I think we had it dialed in. I know that we were prepared for the weather, and there's only so much you can prepare for the heat. We expected it, and we just kind of slogged through it. I wish I could say that I just really rocked it, but for me, the physical conditioning wasn't there. Troy was doing great because he has a regular exercise program. I don't. So there were times where I'd really struggle on the uphill. And I know next time that I would start planning further ahead for that part of the preparation. We did training hikes with all of our gear with a full pack. And we felt good at the end of those. We thought, we are ready. But 3 or 4 days of that consecutively is a challenge. And I think that it would have been a little bit of a smoother ride if I had been able to invest a little more time in being physically prepared for it. Now, 2 things that didn't help were that I had twisted my ankle on Stairs Mountain on Friday morning. So the whole rest of the trail I had my ankle wrapped. And I thought my allergies were bothering me, but after the fact, I realized I was coming down with a respiratory bug, so that probably didn't help on the uphill. But that has nothing to do with the trail. Those are just little circumstances that you have to deal with that come up.
How did you feel about the way your pack was organized and your pack weight? Do you think that you had that where you wanted it to be? Or do you think if you did a trip like this again, you'd try to trim down on some of what you were carrying?
There are definitely opportunities to lighten the load. And as I'm able to, I'll do that. One thing that made the weight a little bit more challenging on this trail, of course, was the water. We were carrying a ton of water weight. I had 2 48-ounce water bottles because I prefer the water bottles to the hydration bladder. And I had a 32-ounce collapsible hydropack bottle that I carried.
So that's 4 liters of water. That's like a gallon of water you're carrying.
It was pretty hot.
A gallon of water weighs more than 8 pounds. So that's a lot of weight.
Yes, it really is. But I'm glad that we were carrying that much water because there were some times where we got pretty low and we were kind of tracking our mileage and anticipating when the next water source would be. And it was a little ways ahead. So we tried to stay well hydrated and manage that as best we could. But in the end, yes, it added weight, but we needed it. So I need to find other areas to be a little more efficient.
Understood. I'm not suggesting you don't have enough water. I guess I'm a little bit surprised by how little water there was, but it sounds like with a lot of ridge hiking, that is part of why there was so little water, because you're not going to find water at the top of a ridge.
Absolutely.
So as you look back on this, why is this a trail that you think other people should consider hiking?
It's beautiful. It's challenging, but it's an accessible trail. There are plenty of opportunities to camp, so you can be flexible with your itinerary, ample options for a shuttle. And everyone that tells you, oh, I've hiked that trail before, it was beautiful, I loved it, I'll do it any chance I get, say it for a reason. Okay.
As you look back on this hike, what is a particular moment or memory that stands out for you?
The finish. Knowing we'd completed it. Because this was a test for both of us. Troy had never attempted a hike of this length and this difficulty. And I had done one longer through hike, but not nearly as challenging. So while there were so many wonderful moments along the trail, the views, the flora, the camaraderie with my hiking partner and other hikers we met, the feeling of accomplishment in finishing was the high point.
That's actually a great answer, because a lot of times people remember a particular sunrise or sunset or something like that.
Yeah.
But I know as soon as you said the finish, like I had a gut feeling of what that is because I've done it so many times. And I know how good that can feel, particularly at the end of a very challenging trail. And there really is that sense of accomplishment. So I've probably had, half of my hikes where that was the highlight moment. So
absolutely.
That's great to hear.
Yeah. There were so many moments where I thought, God I'm so lucky to be out here.
Yes.
I'm
yes.
so lucky to be experiencing this. I remember standing there in front of that rhododendron at Sassafras Gap, just marveling at how beautiful that tree was. Or the grove of spruce trees that we camped in, where we found places to hang the hammocks at the base of Black Balsam Knob. That grove was absolutely majestic. The view from the top of Cold Mountain. And like I said earlier, I wish I could say that I rocked this one, but it really did kick my butt. And I think that's what made the feeling of passing that trailhead marker much more meaningful at the end. Knowing that we'd tested ourselves and passed it and accomplished what we wanted to and felt so good about it, even though we were tired, even though we were sore. That's the high point, without a doubt.
Dane Schuckman, thank you for telling me about your hike of the Art Loeb Trail with your friend Troy. But while I have you, I've got a few more questions, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
So what is one piece of gear you don't leave home without?
Oh, man. Every episode I hear you ask this question and I think about it. I really do. It's tricky because the one thing, and this is not my answer, because I don't want to dodge or cop out, but one thing that I always carry on me is my 10 Essentials kit, plus a trash bag for packing out any trash I create or find. It's a single dry bag packed with all those basics I would need in an emergency. And I carry that no matter how long or short the hike is, but that's not one single piece of gear.
All right.
So if I had to pick one, it would be my Zoleo emergency beacon.
Okay.
And all too often in emergency, you find that the common theme is that the individual in crisis didn't have a way to call for help. And all they had was a cell phone, and that's probably not going to save your life. So I always charge it and test it and carry it with me on every trip.
I like that answer because I didn't used to carry one, but in the last few years, as my kids have grown up and moved out of the house and gone off to do their own things, I'm finding myself doing a lot more solo hikes.
Exactly.
And yes. my wife is much happier now that I do those hikes with, I use a Garmin InReach, but that has the emergency capability. And I feel better. She feels better. And I can, when I get to camp every night, I send her a text that has the location tagged to it so she can see where I am for the evening. And it does give me peace of mind, and that's worth a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do the same thing. I spend a lot of time out there alone, which I love, but very often it's either just me or me with the kids. And my wife loves to join us, but sometimes I just take my 12-year-old son out and it's just the two of us. And if something happened to me, he needs something that he can use to call for help. And one reason I chose the Zoleo was that it's so easy for a kid to operate, in addition to all the other features and how effective it has been. So I just don't want to risk something happening and not being able to come back.
Understood. What's the one hike or trip that you've done besides this one that you think others shouldn't miss out on?
I'd say the Art Trail.
That's also in North Carolina, right?
Yes. It's in the southern central part of the state, south of Asheboro. And it's in the Uwharrie National Forest as part of an area that is under the umbrella of Three Rivers Land Trust. And when I did the thru hike, it was sponsored by the Land Trust. That they do this every spring and every fall. So there are ample opportunities for even a straight-up beginner to go out there and have a great experience with a supported thru hike. And there is beautiful terrain and a whole lot of history. And it's not nearly as challenging as the Art Loeb, although it is 10 miles longer.
Okay.
The Uwharrie thru hike is 42 miles.
How long did the hike take to do? And I know you were doing it through the Land Trust sponsored hike, so it was probably their pace, not yours. But how long did they set that hike for? How many days?
4 days.
4 days.
We were able to kind of go our own pace. We just all kind of spread out. We weren't all hiking as a group. There were probably about 50 hikers. It was a large group that spring. But I started on Thursday morning and finished up Sunday afternoon.
Oh, that's cool though that they sponsor the hike like that and get everyone out there on it. Like you said, not exactly hiking together, but at least sort of same general time.
It's a great tool for outreach for the land trust because you get to see some of the highlights of the land that they've conserved, and it's really beautiful. Now, each night you stop at a designated campsite. So you hike your own pace, and every night you stop where they are set up for the night. And when I did the hike, every night they had dinner.
Oh, I was going to ask you that. That sounds awesome.
It was great. The running joke is that it's the only through hike you're going to gain weight on.
Nice.
But they also have the Land Trust trailer, and everyone gets a gallon of water. They have the trail angels that will make sure there is enough firewood for campfires that night at the campsite. And then every day there's at least one relief station at a trail junction or a road crossing that is maintained by a group of trail angels or volunteers for the Land Trust. So you might get to the Joe Moffett trailhead at the base of Little Long Mountain, and there's a table there with some fresh fruit and bottles of Gatorade. Usually one of the local outdoor outfitters will sponsor a tent and a table at one of the trailheads along the route with honey stingers and noon tablets and bottled water. So there are opportunities to make the hike a little bit easier, and you'll see seasoned veterans of the trails out there, and you'll see people who have never attempted anything like this before, like me, and it's a great experience.
That's really cool to have that kind of support.
Yeah.
What's the next trip on your list?
Well, there are a few options, and it all depends on when I can work this into the schedule next year. Troy and I have a good friend who lives near Charlotte who wants to do the Foothills Trail, which you've covered in another episode.
Yep.
And he's determined to do that in the spring or the fall. So we could do that trip. And we'd probably take 6 or 7 days to do that one. Really take our time and enjoy it. I do also want to do the Uwharrie Trail again, either with the Land Trust or solo. But there's a shorter overnight trip I'd love to do in the western part of the state near Bryson City. Last summer, we took the kids to Bryson City and spent a week exploring the Smoky Mountains National Park and some of the other trails in the area. And I found some mention of the Wesserbald Fire Tower, which is on the Appalachian Trail near the Nantahala Outdoor Center. I thought, oh, we can do that trail. That'll be fine. I'll put the little one in the kid carrier on my back. We'll hike up, see the fire tower, hike down. Nothing prepared me for how cool that was. It's this big fire tower frame at the top of the ridge, and the cab burned up in the 90s, but the Forest Service replaced it with an observation platform. And you can camp up there.
That's cool.
You can sleep up there. So you get up to the top of this fire tower, and you got these gorgeous 360-degree views from the top. And as long as the weather's good, you could set up at the top of that thing and just have an amazing night. So one of those 3 minimum will happen in the next year.
Cool. That sounds really neat. Last question. What is a backpacking meal you could eat every day?
I love Stowaway Gourmet's backpacking meals. I don't know if I could pick just one because they are such good quality. I would serve them to dinner guests at home. They are that good. Their lamb bourguignon is ridiculous. The bison, black bean, and beer chili is delicious, and it'll warm you up on a cold night. So I'd have to say that I could eat a Stowaway Gourmet backpacking meal every day, and I'd be happy. Now, Pinnacle is also really good, and they have an herbed sausage gravy and jalapeno cheddar biscuit breakfast that I could eat 4 or 5 days of the week.
All right. Well, those are good recommendations.
They are delicious.
Dane Schuckman, thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeremy. It really has been a pleasure.
So I hope that Dane and I have inspired you to hike the Art Loeb Trail in western North Carolina. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please tell a friend about it, or better yet, give us a good review on whichever podcast service you use. And keep in mind that this podcast is entertainment and meant to spark your interest. If you decide to hike the trail, do your own research. Like anything else worth doing, outdoor adventure has risk. So when you go, pack your common sense, and when you get back, tell me how it went. Before we go, I want to remind you of our sponsor, Outdoor Herbivore. Outdoor Herbivore makes delicious backpacking meals that are vegetarian and vegan, but as I always say, you don't need to be a vegetarian or a vegan to really enjoy these meals. They are made with high-quality ingredients, they have tons of calories for a hungry hiker, and are conveniently packaged in boil-in-a-bag packaging so that they can be easily cooked with just adding hot water while you're on the trail, and stir and seal, and you've got a hot meal in 10 minutes. I love them, and if you've heard prior episodes, you know that I bring them on every backpacking trip I go on. Even though they are a sponsor of the show, it didn't start that way. I started as a customer and was buying their meals regularly and reached out to them to see if they were interested in supporting the show. So I continue to be appreciative of the fact that they do. And I think I've said in recent episodes that we have some more exciting news on that front coming. Our discount code is still in effect, TWH10P, Trails Worth Hiking 10%, get you 10% off your order at Outdoor Herbivore. Outdoor Herbivore ships worldwide, so even if you don't live in the United States, you can order from them. They also sell bulk ingredients in case you want to make your own meals and not rely on their pre-made meals. Just want to let you know, if you're listening to this episode in real time when it comes out in February 2024, we're going to be changing up the discount codes pretty soon. So if you want to use the TWH10P code to buy anything on Outdoor Herbivore's website, do it now because things will be changed up a little bit in our next episode, I think. No promises. Sometimes these things don't go as planned. In any event, check them out, Outdoor Herbivore at outdoorherbivore.com. Next time on Trails Worth Hiking, we go back to Utah in the American West, but not to the deserts of southern Utah. Instead, we embark on a challenging, remote, high-altitude, up-and-down adventure through forest, subalpine meadows, mountain passes above tree line, and filling up our water bottles in alpine lakes, where we'll be exposed not only to beauty, but also to the weather, which can be an added challenge in a hike with so much open space and long views. Next time on Trails Worth Hiking, we travel the Uinta Highline Trail in the Uinta Mountains of northeastern Utah. If you have any questions or feedback on this episode, or ideas for a future episode, including if you want to be a guest and talk about a trail that you've hiked, reach out to me at trailsworthhiking@gmail.com. So start planning your next hike, and before you know it, you'll be on the trail. Thanks for listening.